Hey everyone, welcome back to Made Possible by Pop Culture. This is the podcast where I ask my guests to come on and talk about what from the pop culture world was greatly an influence on them when they were growing up, but also what is an influence on them today, and simply what are they loving from pop culture today. Once again, I'm your host and producer, Danielle Turchiano, and I'm so excited to welcome my special guest today. I hope you all are too. This is Jarrett Hill. He's an artist, he's a journalist, he's a professor, he's an NAACP award winner, he's the former president of the National Association of Black Journalists in Los Angeles, and he's the co-author of Historically Black Phrases from I Ain't One of Your Little Friends to Who All Gonna Be There. So Jarrett, welcome. I feel like I had so much more to say about you in your intro, and then I was like, ooh, I'm talking too much. So welcome.
I always say there's nothing harder than having to follow a good bio because it's like now you got to live up to whatever all that was. So I'm not mad at it.
Well, it's a great bio. And I didn't even talk about how you were the journalist who broke the story about Melania Trump being a plagiarist. I mean, most of my guests so far have been strictly focused on entertainment journalism discussion. And like, obviously, you have a lot more that we can talk about if we want to get into it, which I wanted to point that out for the audience because I feel like huge story, big deal. I had a big deal for you in your career, I'm assuming as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're coming up on 8 years since that series of tweets really changed my life in July 2016. And yeah, I'm a politics and pop culture journalist and kind of look at the way that those things intersect oftentimes, thinking about race and gender and sexuality and all of those different things. And now also like with more of a focus even in the ways that religion plays in there. So yeah, it's been a very interesting career and you know, us working together at Variety in different kinds of ways and all kinds of stuff. It's been great.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you being on here today. And I want you to be the one, I like to ask my guests to be the one to set up what piece of pop culture or piece of history, really. I feel like sometimes I say pop culture and it feels like it's limiting how we're discussing it. What you chose from your younger years that was an influence on you.
So I was really, really conflicted in this choice because there's so many things. I mean, everyone has like, how do you choose your favorite child? And like from a scripted perspective, when I was thinking about this, Living Single is like my number one sitcom. And I feel like I'm always talking about it. And I was like, should I do that? And then as I was thinking about it, I was like, the thing that really resonates with me was daytime talk. And like I loved talk shows. I grew up watching Oprah as much as I possibly could. I'm like, how many little boys are watching The View? I don't know, right? Like with Meredith Vieira and
Maybe,
Star
but you know
Jones.
what? Maybe more than we think, because even if they weren't as into it, like their mother maybe had it on, their father maybe had it on, their babysitter,
Absolutely.
there probably are more than talk about it.
Well, and like that kind of thing was true for me as a kid with my grandmother. I was just saying this to someone yesterday. My grandmother, my aunt, and my babysitter all watched QVC endlessly. Right. So I knew off the top of my head that the phone number was 1-800-345-1212. Right. And you could just like call into QVC. My aunt had a plasma TV and the QVC logo was burned into the screen.
Oh
Like,
no.
you know what I mean? Like a lot of exposure to
Yes,
certain
yes.
kinds of things, right? But daytime talk was always the thing that I loved so much. And like starting in about seventh grade, there was a bit with my friends that we were all on the Jarrett Hill show. And like I have been doing a talk show bit for years and years and years. And so thinking about doing this, I was like, oh, I think we should talk about talk shows
Yeah.
because that's been such a fun part of my history.
Well, first of all, the Jarrett Hill show feels like something you should be developing now. So I'm glad to hear that it started way back then. But I also think what I find really interesting when I ask people to come on and talk about something in pop culture, you're right. A lot of people go straight for scripted. They don't even think about unscripted. And I don't set that parameter. You can talk about whatever you want, but I also do have that question in the back of my mind of, you know, thus far, my guests are all journalists for a reason. I want to shine a light on that profession and why people do what they do. But I think we often overlook those that came before us as being the influence, right? Like you may not want to call certain talk show hosts journalists. It's sometimes a little bit different what they're doing in terms of, are they promotional tools or are they asking hard hitting questions? But it's
Yeah.
still, I think you can learn so much about what that job will be or could be and who you want to be, especially if you're doing interviews. So you mentioned a couple of different shows. Which one, if any, do you feel like really gave you the this is the type of interviewer I want to be
Well,
direction?
so like I know like it's a little known show and only a few people have seen it, but like the Oprah show was so transformative for me, right? Like what's so funny when I think about my experience of the Oprah show was as a kid, it did not occur to me how famous Oprah was because I wasn't talking about Oprah with many other people, right?
That's true.
And we didn't
Yeah.
have social media and we didn't have like the internet and those different kinds of things. And so I kind of thought that like I was the only person who knew about this show in some kinds of ways, right? Like my parents knew because they might see it on, my babysitter would know or
Mhm.
whatever. But like it did not really sink into me how famous Oprah was until I moved away to college in like 2005. I was like, I mean, mind you, this is like toward the end of the show, right? Like obviously she's a global superstar and I know that, but like it just felt like a very personal
Yeah.
relationship. And I always loved the versatility of that show. I loved that we can do a sit down interview, we can do a makeover, we can, buy someone a house, we can give away cars, we can have an empty room and just talk with one person.
Yeah.
And like as a person who is, blessed to be able to do many different kinds of things, I always loved that format. And I think nowadays we're seeing talk shows that kind of fit into a lane. And I think like Tamron Hall kind of
Mm.
does what Oprah did back in the day. Sherry Shepherd today is
Yeah.
kind of doing what Ellen did in a certain kind of way. And like, but that kind of format was always really cool to me.
And it's interesting because you mentioned that you felt like it was very intimate in a way, like beyond not being able to talk about it with people because we didn't have social media. I think what you're speaking to is really also her style, the way that she
Yeah.
would just get personal. There was a connection. It felt like they were, I don't know, I always felt like when I watched it, there was a connection between the host and the guest that made me feel like they walked away with something special, even if they didn't know each other before they came on.
Yeah, like I just sent a note over to my friends at the Sherry Shepherd show saying like one of the things that I've been appreciating about their show these days is like I enjoy segments with guests that I would not have
Mm.
otherwise really cared to listen to or like pause for and listen and see, you know?
Hmm.
But I think that like with Sherry right now, for instance, Sherry is giving us something that's really upbeat and joyful and like you can tell that she's there to give us a show every day,
Right.
right? She's twirling and jumping and doing the things and
Right.
cracking
She's
the jokes
enjoying
and doing
herself.
material, right? And like I think back in the day with Oprah, what we appreciated was watching someone excellent in what they're doing, right? And like and doing it so well and at such a high level and obviously, the biggest show in the world, right? But
Yeah.
also still having such a personal connection. And so I really love that about the Oprah show. I also I put a few shows in the
You
email
did.
with
And
you.
we'll get to all of them if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I think what really works about Oprah is also something that, works about Sherry, but then I there's nothing that has really struck me like these other shows in the Rosie O'Donnell show,
Hmm.
The View, Wendy Williams, right? I've really loved women on television. I don't know if it's me being a little gay kid my whole life, or what, but like
But you know
these
what? I think
women.
there's something to be said for there. First of all, there was a prevalence. Men were in late night, women were in daytime. Like that was the assumption was that daytime is women's space, which I don't think we need to segregate that way. But at the same time, I think that also speaks to when we're growing up and we're not staying up for late night. These are our influences because these are all we see.
Yeah, well, and like even like as an adult and starting to work in daytime talk, I started
Mm.
to see like the demographics of the audience when we look at the ratings, and it's like, oh, for a long time, and not as much the case now, but still in certain places, women are the primary audience at home at that time,
Hmm.
right? Like, especially, the further back we go. And so, programming for women has always been something that has, daytime kind of stamp on it. And like as daytime talk shows are concerned, I had so much fun with the Rosie O'Donnell show, right? There's that upbeat song, and there's John McD and the
Yeah.
McDLT, and there's
The
koosh
koosh ball.
balls
I
and
was gonna
the,
say,
you know
I
what I
love the
mean? Like,
koosh balls.
yeah, right. And then you want a koosh ball and you're like, where do I get the launcher thing? And she's got the different desks and the different open and the live the but like kind of stuff, right? It was like it was so fun. And I loved that show. And I just thought it was so interesting. Also, like to then start to see toward the end Rosie
Mm,
outside of the show and how
right.
different her personality was from the persona that we saw on the Rosie
Yeah.
O'Donnell show, right? And to see someone walk away from it, right? Like at the height, right? And say like, no, I really want to spend time with my family
Hmm.
and like I've made enough money. And to see how 9/11 had an impact on that, right? And how that can change things for so many people. But Rosie was like such a big one for me. And it came on right before Oprah and they were like a tag team.
You know what's so interesting though? I mean, I wanted to get into this. I'm glad you already brought this up, is you said the word persona. And that was what was I found always, I thought a little bit of a disconnect between how I viewed these shows and how some other people viewed the shows. When I was very young, I just assumed these are who you are. I don't assume you're putting on a face. And we obviously know now from toxic behavior that has come out on certain sets. That's not true of everybody. But even to when I was very, very young, it was Regis and Kathy Lee to the point where I thought they were married. You know what I mean? Like it was a different way of watching when you're a kid. At what point did you feel like you started to realize, oh, they are maybe playing up something. They are maybe playing a personality, and did that affect the way that you either watched the show or the way that you then said, well, I need to develop a personality to be in this business?
So I love this question. Well, you talked about thinking that who was married? Who did you say?
Regis
Regis
Philbin
and
and
Kathy
Kathy
Lee.
Lee Gifford, which
And like,
obviously they have different last names. Maybe that should have been my first hint. I don't
well,
know.
no, but like I remember someone referring to Pat Sajak and Vanna White as TV husband and wife. And I
That's a
was
good
like,
example. Yeah.
oh, yes, like they're TV husband and wife, right? And like that's a different thing, right? And like that, I remember that kind of going on for me. And I remember after Rosie's show, like after she came out and like she had like a different kind of personality, I was
Hmm.
like, it started to click for me in a different kind of way. Like, oh, she was showing us a side of herself, right? She was amplifying part of, but didn't feel comfortable amplifying
Right.
all of it, right? And as a little gay kid, you recognize that and see, like, oh, she couldn't do that there.
Right.
Maybe I can't do
Mm.
that out here, or maybe I should, or maybe you know what I mean? It makes you ask those kinds of questions. And I think for myself, I watched people on television like share their own personal story. And when I moved away to college, we this was still pre-social media. MySpace
Yeah.
was still like kind of
Yep.
hitting, but but like I remember so many people asking me to send them emails when I moved away to college. And I was like, I ended up having like a really long list of people who wanted emails. And I was like,
Huh.
I don't, what am I supposed to say? Right. And so then I put together like a newsletter. I was like, all of you wanted an
Wow.
email, so like here it is, right? And like I made a monthly newsletter that was like talking about what I was doing away at college and like and that started and ended up by the time it ended, I had like 10 different people writing with me. We were doing a monthly publication with hundreds of people subscribed to it. It was like absurd, right? But
No,
like
that's
it was like,
fantastic. First of all, I don't know what year this was. You don't have to say if you don't want to, but the fact that newsletters are such a big thing now in journalism and in marketing, like you
yeah.
were on the forefront of that. So I
That
think
was
that's
yeah,
amazing.
that was 2005 it started. And so like we were doing that and having a fun time with it and like getting to talk about different things. But I modeled it after O Magazine, right? Like because there was always a different photo I had to take to get on right. It was all the color scheme was based on
Uh-huh.
whatever I had
But it's
on.
always you on the cover.
Right. Well, it's a journal show. I was like, I guess I got to figure out what to do, right? There's a J on the front. It was very, very much O Magazine, but with me,
That's
right?
awesome.
And so I was trying to like tell stories and like these are the things I've been learning living in a new city and like these are my friends and that kind of thing. And so it didn't even occur to me until a couple of years ago like I was already like doing like influencery kind of
Mm,
things, right? And so like trying to figure out what to share and what not to share, how
yeah.
much of my personality to give. And like, I'm pretty protective of my family, right?
Hmm.
Especially since the Melania Trump plagiarism story.
Yeah.
And, there's some interesting people on on both sides. What's
Right.
that
And you, I
camera?
mean, you, first of all, I would worry about you also. I mean, if people are upset with what
Absolutely.
happened and they're going to dox you, and then they're also going to dox your family, like you can't protect yourself as much because you're already a public figure. But if you can protect them, who, if they're not, I think we have to do that these days.
Yeah. Well, and like it's as a journalist, one of my favorite questions to ask people who are very private. Um, they're not going to tell you about their relationship or their this or their
Mm.
that, but I do love to ask them like, how do you think about that? Right?
Hmm.
Like, how do you make those decisions, or what is the conversation you're having with yourself about what you share and what you don't share? Because that's an interesting thing to me, right? And like my family kind of felt like you never share us. You didn't. We went
Mm.
on vacation and you didn't post, and I was like, I've told you guys like before, like why I don't, and they're like, oh, well, we haven't talked about that in a long time. We didn't know, right?
Mm.
But like to your question about like watching these people, like you see these people over the years, and like some of them are very forthcoming with information
Yeah.
about their lives, and then some of them you're like, I don't even know anything about this person outside of like whatever I see in this interview. You know what I
Right.
mean? And I find myself right now kind of in a place where I see my profile growing, and like we're
Hmm.
starting to win awards and our show is growing and all these other things, and I'm like, okay, well, how do I need to recalibrate? Like, do I want to adjust this, or do I want to share more or less, and those different kinds of things.
Do you feel like though, I mean, because you talked about when Rosie came out and acknowledging, okay, maybe she couldn't, or maybe she didn't want to, and should I? Do you feel like
Hmm.
a lot of that though is also the time? Like if you were doing this when Rosie
Mm.
had her show, maybe you would also be protecting parts of yourself in different ways than you are now? Or do you feel like, well, I've learned from maybe their mistakes. Maybe I feel she should have been more open. It would have helped me to see someone gay in daytime.
Well, I've never been a person that believed that people have to come out
Sure.
for the sake of the culture, right? And I mean, there are plenty of celebrities who have been rumored to be queer or that we know are queer, right? But have never said it out loud.
Hmm.
And so I've not felt that. I do know though, like the first time I realized what it was to be gay, and that's what I was watching Oprah, right? Like Greg Louganis was on and talking about being queer and having HIV. And like now, as a person who is queer and has HIV, right? Like I'm like, that moment is something that I've
Mm.
always remembered in my mind of being like, oh, I didn't have HIV at the time, but I was like, oh, what he's talking about, that's what I am. That's
Right.
me. Right. And like, and then went on for another decade of hiding it, right? And denying it to myself and like trying to pray it away and all of
Mm.
those different kinds of things. And so I certainly think the time was a big part of it, but I know that there are still plenty of people who today in
Yeah.
2024 aren't really willing to talk about it. So I think it's a mix of things.
But for you, I mean, do you feel like having that experience made you want to be more open once I know you just said that you were denying it for some time, but now I feel like that's such an important part of who you are, how open you are.
Hmm.
I mean, would you say that that is something you learned from anybody in particular, or is that just you?
I think it's something that I'm still learning every day. I remember being at at like a premiere event for I Want to Dance with Somebody, the Whitney
Mm.
Houston film that came out a year ago. And Ricky Minor and Babyface were on stage being interviewed by iconic music journalist Danielle Smith. And uh, one of the things that they talked about in that conversation, Ricky Minor was talking about Whitney Houston having recorded the national anthem on her first take.
Mm.
Because like you have to record, you have to voice
Yeah.
over, you have to lip sync that at the Super Bowl. And he was talking about how like he had said like, I think this is what I'm thinking, and like what we ended up hearing was really her rehearsal, right? And like they recorded it and used it. And Danielle was asking him about like what was something special or powerful that he learned about from working with Whitney so much, because he was her music director throughout all of her live performances. And he said that it was something so special about Whitney knowing what she had and embracing it, because then she could use it.
Mm.
And like I just heard that a year and some change ago, but like it really hit for me like, oh, and I'm in a period in my life now where I feel like I'm in the origin story of my superhero movie where I'm like, oh, whoa, what was that? Right? And like, oh, hmm. right, you know what I mean, and like being able to like kind of do some things and like being able to better appreciate it. And
Yeah.
so to your question about like how did the influence happen there, I'm learning more and more, like the more I am myself, the more all of this works,
Mm,
right? And like watching different people over the years be themselves or not, right? And like how that has worked for them or not, right?
yeah.
And like because I think of people who I won't name because they're not out, but like plenty of people that we know of publicly that are queer,
Mhm.
right? And like it's working for them to not talk about it,
True.
right?
Yeah.
And like there's always like a rumor and like a undercurrent conversation or like a kind of a wink to camera sometimes, right? And it works for them. And like I think for me it's been a big thing to just really be able to embrace like the powers that I have to be able to use them.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point too, because I think what you want your career to be can be different, or not even just your career, what you want your life to be and your legacy to be. Ultimately, I think, who are we to say, what someone else's should be? And so if it works for you, great. But what I find fascinating about that is I think that what works across everything. I don't think it's just, as we're talking about coming out, but I don't think it's just that. I think you can easily look at, who's an example? Let's find an example. I mean, Ellen DeGeneres, I think, is a great example of, she was out when she had her talk show, and she crafted a talk show around a certain personality, and it worked for her for so many years. I mean, that show, I worked on that show very, very briefly, and it was an amazing thing to watch, just the empire unfold, right? But that would not have worked for somebody else. You can't, you know
Hmm.
what I mean? They're different. I don't even know how to phrase it sometimes when I look at these people's careers and what they've accomplished and how they've accomplished it. And I think like a lot of that is, you have to know what you can do, and you have to know what you should do, and you have to know what to say yes to, because there's so much of like, just say yes, right? But I don't know if that works all the time, because sometimes I feel like you get into well, I said yes to something and now I'm trapped in this image. People think this is what I am.
Well, and I mean, even the saying yes kind of thing, there's always the variables of like how many options do you have?
That's
Right. And
true.
like,
Yeah.
is this the thing that you have? I think about Kerry Washington and Little Fires Everywhere with Reese Witherspoon. And Reese Witherspoon is like, I made better choices than
Mm,
you, right? And Kerry Washington says back to her, you had better choices. Right. And so like
yes.
that piece of it is even something interesting because I think about Rosie O'Donnell. I'm like, did Rosie O'Donnell have the option to come out at that time? You know what I mean? Like,
Probably
could
not.
she
Yeah.
have?
I
Right.
really
You know
don't
what
think
I
she
mean?
did.
Yeah, and like I think about the other shows that I love, like The View. The View was an interesting dynamic of being able to see different people who did live their lives out loud, but like some who kind of kept it to themselves and some who were like very forthcoming with it. I always think about Star Jones on The View and like
Mhm.
how that ended, right? With
Yeah.
the her getting married and having a wedding and the way that that had an impact on viewers' view on her after she had lost all the weight but didn't say why, right? And like the way that you share certain parts of your life and you don't
Mhm.
share other parts of it can really have an impact on the way that people see and think about you and the work that you do. So I've seen so many of those kinds of personalities. Wendy Williams being another one of those, right? Like Wendy,
Yes.
we're seeing, it kind of in the zeitgeist again
I was
this
going to say,
year.
especially now, like what
Yeah.
we're seeing of her is not what she's choosing to share. She
Well, and
can't
like
necessarily make those
I don't
decisions entirely.
know. I don't know.
Really?
And like I was on Pop Culture Happy Hour talking about
Yeah.
this when the documentary came out because like on one hand I feel like I cringe, right? Because you're like, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know this was happening." And you feel terrible for Wendy and the family and so many things. And then I also know like Wendy's only big dream was to be famous. And so being followed around by a camera crew
Mm,
was very much in on brand, right? And
right.
so like and she's like sitting down and talking to the cameras, but then it's
That's
like,
true.
well,
But
how much is she does she have her faculties to know what she's making decisions about? It's hard
right.
to know. So,
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking, in terms of like, maybe you want the camera crew to be there, but do you understand what they're there to do? And the
Yeah.
final product, is that what you wanted it to be? I mean, that's where I'm just cringe is probably the best word, because I struggled to watch it. I'll be honest. I not to get off topic, but I just, because of what I knew she was, and the empire that she had built, and just what a force she was, to then watch her like that, it felt voyeuristic in a way that made me uncomfortable.
To think about this through the lens of daytime, like I think about the ways that we see people on television in their show
Mhm.
and how distinctly different they can be outside of that, right? Whether it's the look, the hair, the accent, the language, the vernacular, the tone, the dialect, the accent, whatever it is, right? And like, oh, that's a distinctly different person, right?
Mhm.
Or oh, that's pretty similar to what I expected. And like with Wendy, Wendy had the show, she had the after show, she was like appearing in other places. And so like we always felt like we had a good sense of who Wendy was
Mhm.
because there wasn't a whole lot of code switching, right? It didn't seem like it, at least. And now we're seeing her in this other kind of way, and like the reason I'm conflicted on whether or not I'm comfortable with it is because I really want to know what she thinks about the final
Yeah.
documentary, the
Yeah.
all 75 hours of it, whatever it was. And
I
like
really
I'm
don't think
all
she watched it.
I don't think she did, and I don't know like her state of mind to be able to
Right.
process it, right? But I also think to myself, like, Wendy loved Page Six and
Hmm.
that type of gossipy, tabloidy like culture. And like this documentary does kind of feel like that. You know what I mean? And like maybe that was up her alley. I don't know.
Hmm.
Like I'm very torn on it. But
Yeah.
like when we think about this from a talk show lens, like on the in the talk show perspective, like Wendy was always pretty polished. The hair is always
Yes.
done, the makeup is
Yes.
always done. She's always in a look and she's got a shoe until the end there. And like then to see people outside of these contexts, it's a very interesting dynamic to see
Yeah.
again the persona and the actual personality.
Was there any show, any of one of these talk shows that you watch that you've already mentioned, or one that you haven't mentioned, where that made a difference for you in terms of you love the show, you love the persona, and then when you saw who they were outside, if they were different, maybe you didn't love the show as much. Maybe you had a different feeling on who the person was. Maybe the realization that it wasn't all true was not what you wanted.
Mm. Oh, good question. I
I
love it.
ask this because I have this, not to make this all about me, but I have
No,
this
yeah.
terrible ability of, whenever I work with a young person, like an intern or just somebody starting out their career, I have this terrible ability of accidentally ruining some of their heroes, because
Oh
they'll be
no.
like, I love so and so, and I won't think, and I'll just spout off a story, and then I watch their face fall of like, oh, that person is a terrible person. I didn't know that. I'm like, I'm so sorry. I've been in this business for 100 years. I'm jaded. I'm so sorry. But now I'm just curious if other people have similar, not, and I'm not asking you to spill tea on like a
No, no.
person that
Well,
hasn't been outed yet, and then we all get in trouble. I just mean from a more general, you had an awakening of like, not everything that I'm seeing is real, and what does that do for
yeah.
my expectations and perception?
So, yes, there has been a person. Um, I'm like, oh, what do I say here? What can I say? So I worked on a talk show when I first moved here within the first year of living here. And I'm just gonna be candid about it, and it'll be what it'll be. Ricky Lake did a reboot of her talk show,
Mhm.
the new Ricky Lake show,
Yeah.
and I worked on that show, and it was a really incredible experience for me as a producing production assistant, to like learn how a talk show works, right, and how to put together segments, and like no one was watching, so like what
I
difference did it
mean,
make?
I was watching because
I mean,
you heard me make that. Oh yeah,
yeah.
recollection.
Well, like whenever I say there was a talk show, most people are like, "Oh my God, I had no idea." I was like, "That's the
Oh,
problem." Right. And so like it got canceled after the first season. But my interactions with Ricky were not always like what I wanted them to be.
sure.
I later found out that like she was in a deal that she was really unhappy with. Like her husband ended up, at the time, her husband at the time ended up um uh, taking his life by suicide, and like there was various different things that happened in her life soon thereafter. And so I was like, I don't know what Ricky was going through, so I'm not going to be like too hard on it, but I
Yeah.
will say like I came away from it not loving her in the way that I did when I came in. And like then you also have to recognize like, oh, people are living real lives, right? Like,
Mhm.
and then also as a person who grew up always wanting a talk show and like pretending I had a talk show, to be that close to like a
Yeah.
person who was doing it, I was like, wow, she has like a whole life going on outside of this, right? And I think that when we watch these talk shows or any of these kinds of things, we only see this person through the context of what we're watching. And we think of the housewives as just being
Mm.
housewives. And it's like, you saw 4 minutes of that person's week, right, on a show. This is a whole life. And so I had that experience, and I've
Well,
I've had
I
to give a
also
little bit more grace.
no, I was gonna say, I think like what you just said though makes a lot of sense to me because when you grew up watching these shows, you maybe weren't thinking about not just the life outside, but also what they're doing on the show outside of the 42 minutes you're seeing them on screen,
Yeah.
how depending on how much they're involved in the production of it and you know, pre-tape segments and vetting guests and whatever. Everyone's a little bit different. But then I do also think there's the piece of it of you said what I wanted my interaction with her to be, because if you grow up watching these people, you sometimes you do put them on a pedestal and you're like, I
Hmm.
want them to be exactly what I remember from maybe this one very specific moment or this one very specific episode. That's not who they are 24/7. That's not who they are outside of that one very specific moment an episode, I think. Which I think is very important for people to understand and to not get totally dissuaded by. You can have an experience and maybe it's not exactly what you want, but you're not then saying, "Oh, I'm leaving the industry. How dare you?" You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I'm
Yeah.
going to do something else. No, you're saying, "All right, I take it, I understand it, I'm learning from it. And when I have my talk show, I will do X, Y, or Z."
Well, and like something else that I think I have a much better appreciation for now than I did as a kid watching these shows.
Mhm.
It's not just talk shows, but we're talking about that here, is that
Yeah.
most times that person is the leader of a really big team,
Yes.
right? And I say most times because every talk show host isn't actually leading the show that they're on.
No, and some of them are
Um,
more involved than others. We know that.
yeah,
Well,
and
we
like
know that. The audience at home
right.
now
And I
knows
mean,
that.
some of the people who aren't leading their own shows are doing it for good reason, right? Like it is a wise choice for them not to be leading
Yeah.
it. For various reasons. But like I didn't have an appreciation for like what leadership is required in those kinds of roles, right? And I say that this is in talk shows, but it also expands in other kinds of ways because I think about this watching an artist documentary, right?
Mm.
Watching Lizzo as she's traveling around the world and performing in these different places, like, oh, you're a leader of a team. You've got all these dancers and a band and a crew and agents and publicists and assistants and creatives and whatever, you know what I mean? It's like, oh, there's a leadership piece of this that's really, really
Yeah.
important. And whether you're on a daytime talk show or you're a musician or a documentarian or whatever it is, that's something that's been sitting with me a lot lately too.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the art, you're not just an artist anymore. The art is unfortunately not enough. You're a whole business, brand, whatever you want to say. And I know I keep trying to force talk show on you because of this conversation, but I mean, you are expanding what you're doing. You are doing stage shows you just did for your book. I'm assuming there's more coming that maybe you can or cannot talk about. What do you feel like is influencing that today? Is it
Yeah,
similar?
so we throughout Black History Month, we took the concept of our book, Historically Black Phrases, from I One of Your Little Friends to Who All Gonna Be There. And we took that and turned it into a live Black culture game show called Historically Black Phrases Live. And it was very eye-opening to me because this was like a an idea that I had last summer and became like a full-scale project for us. And like I'm also like returning to my stand-up
Mm,
roots and like going back to that and various different things that are kind of like putting me on stage. And the idea of a talk show is something that I still really love. Like there's practical elements of it. I'm like, is it something I want right now or something I could see? Or like,
mm,
or you know what I mean? But like I love the idea of talk shows and myself being able to kind of lead one. I moved here with the dream of hosting the 100th Oscars in 2028.
ooh, getting
And so
close.
yeah, we got a few years, but I got some time, and you know we're growing at a nice pace.
Yeah.
So Uh, and so when I think about like the things that are kind of influencing me right now, there's a lot of art and design that's influencing me. One of the things that I started doing, and I'm sure you can actually relate to this, do you have a hard time watching TV just for leisure because it feels like work?
I used to. I mean, when you and I worked together briefly when I was at Variety, and when I was at
Yeah.
Variety, there was no TV for leisure because everything I watched, I had to assess for coverage. So it wasn't, unless I was going to rewatch something old. And even then,
Yeah.
usually I was like, can I watch this and somehow get like an anniversary story out of it?
Yes.
Now,
Right.
I do feel like now I don't have as hard of a time because I'm not doing that same.
Got you.
I'm able to distance a little bit. So, but I mean, I don't know. We'll see what happens, in the next few months if it shifts back.
Well, so like for me, I could be talking about this show on our podcast, on another show, on in a book, or
Mm,
we're writing about it, or like, and so like similarly, watching television always kind of felt like work for me, and
mm,
so I started watching things that there was no way someone was going to be asking me to cover. Right,
okay.
I started watching like old concert documentaries. Right, I'm watching like old Beyonce, the Beyonce
Mm,
Experience, and then I started like kind of seeing what the algorithm was offering me, and I'm like watching U2, and I'm like, oh wow, this is a cool concert full of a lot of songs I've never heard, but like the visuals are really interesting. And Ez Devlin was the production designer on Beyonce's Renaissance tour.
yeah.
And I was like, oh, I've seen this name, and I looked her up, and she had designed the concert that I saw from U2 as well,
Nice.
and another concert that I loved. And so I'm like, I need to learn more about her. And there's like a documentary called wait, I'm gonna
The
clear this up.
Netflix one?
Yes, okay.
Oh,
There's a
abstract.
there's a Netflix doc series called Abstract: The Art of Design, and there's like an hour looking into her work. And so, as Devlin has been someone who's been really, really inspiring me because I have an interior design background as well. And so, like, I'm planning a stand-up special, and I'm like, I'm really excited to do production design for my own show, right? I'm excited to be doing production design as we are on tour and like
Mm,
designing things for our screens and how the audience will engage with things that they'll touch. And we have like part of our show is like church fans that have our faces on them, and they
nice.
can raise them to vote on one side or the other. But also the venues have all been very warm, so they came in handy,
Hmm.
right? And so like I love thinking about all of those kinds of things, and the design stuff on Abstract: The Art of Design. There's also Jonathan Hoffler, I believe is
Hmm.
how you pronounce his name, who's a typeface designer, and like I've always loved fonts and like the design of that kind of stuff. And so that's a lot of influence that I'm having right now. And then lastly, the thing that I didn't put in my email to you, Carrie Fisher has a
Okay.
special that I just watched from 2011 called Carrie Fisher Wishful Drinking.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's like a one woman show stand up
Mhm.
thing. And as I'm writing my own stand up special right now and starting to think about what I'm going to do in it when we film it this summer, a stand-up comic friend, Miles Weber, who I'm working with on my show, he was like, you got to check this out. And it was like mind-blowing to me. I was like, oh my God, there's so many things that I've been thinking about that like she does or tries or references here. And I was like, this is amazing. And so I've been like watching that a lot as well.
First of all, I love that you're talking about design in this way because when you did mention abstract to me when we talked, just for people at home, like I ask people ahead of time what they want to talk about, just so that if I'm unfamiliar with it, I can familiarize myself with it. And I love that you brought this show up because as you just asked me, did you ever watch anything for pleasure basically while you were covering things? And I said everything I had to do was from a coverage angle. This is a show, or it's a docuseries, so I call it a TV show. Some people want to call it, individual films, whatever. This is something that should have been pitched to me, but never was. And so I was
Mm,
not very familiar with it until you brought it up. But then I love the episodes you chose because these are things that when you're at a magazine as a journalist, you should be thinking about, even if you're an editor, not on the design team. But I was often told doesn't matter, just get it on the page at Variety, and I won't name by who.
mm,
So then when I watched the typeface episode and the amount of care put into fonts because of what emotion they're supposed to evoke. I was like, that is an attitude we should be bringing into not just live shows. I think, the few magazines that still exist, maybe some of them have that feeling. I hope that at least the design teams are thinking that way. I do feel the design team at Variety was thinking that way. Just I feel like it's something everyone should be thinking about. But then to hear you talk about this on a broader scale, like it's so exciting to hear you talk about these live shows and what that could mean in terms of taking all of the artistry you have and designing it in these massive ways.
Yeah, we've been like, S. Devlin is a person who talks a lot about light and like imagery and the different things that we see. And if you've been to, the Renaissance concert, to a U2 concert, to a lot, there's so many different things that S. Devlin has produced over her long and illustrious career. And like for me on this tour, I don't have a Beyonce budget, right? Like we're doing venues of 200 people and like we've got a big ass screen and like we're gonna make it do what we can do, right? And so like I'm designing in a screen as best I can and thinking about like where the screen is on stage and placement to the seats and like is it above us, is it behind us, and those kinds of things, and wanting to make sure
Mm.
that like the typeface is big enough for people to read it and to be able to see it between the things and the all those things. And like I remember in the typeface design episode, he talked about like the font of the numbers on your watch. And I was like, oh, I never even thought about that. Right? Like
Yeah.
that's a font.
I mean,
The and like
I never thought about any fonts ever. Like there was typeface on a watch is so small that like I'm
yeah.
sure somebody had a reason, but I just never thought about it. But what got me was the Gotham font. I was like, it's a very clean. He was
Mm-hmm.
talking about it
Mm-hmm.
being, and I looked at it and I was like, it's a very clean, easy to read, simple font. That was my gut reaction because I don't have an artist background. I can't draw. I can't do any of that stuff. And then they were talking about it, the feelings that it evokes from the when Obama used it on the hope and change and putting it on the 9/11 memorial because of what that does for families. And I was just like, it blew my mind, honestly.
Yeah. Well, like, and I'm a person, so my name is spelled in lowercase, right?
Hmm.
I
I was
changed
gonna
my
say
name to
that is on
lowercase.
intentional.
Yeah,
For
like
anyone looking
I
at your Zoom name, because this is on the video, if you're watching on YouTube, that is
on
intentional.
Zoom or like on the front of our book or like in
Mm.
all the different places now, right? Like in many different places that my name shows up, it's usually in lowercase now. And like I've been fascinated by the way that that starts conversation, but I've also always been like a sans serif font type of person, right? Like I always feel like serif fonts feel like traditional and like the establishment, and sans serif, feels a little bit more rebellious and modern, right? And like I've always thought about fonts in that way. So then I watched that, I was like, oh my gosh, someone is like really talking about font way more than I've ever thought about it, right? And like, but fonts are everywhere. Fonts are on your street signs. Fonts are in the logo of the grocery store you're going to. Fonts are, even if they're like plain basic fonts, right?
Yeah.
And like the
Somebody
design
chose
of those
it.
things. Someone chose it, someone designed it, right? Someone created it.
Hmm.
And I think we often think of fonts as like kind of existing in the
Hmm.
computer, like the computer created them, but it's like no, someone like drew those things out and created the curve of the R and the base of that S to be bit wider than the top part of it. And then the T is actually really wide and the W is two of the V's, but they come together, and that kind of stuff is like really, really interesting to me. And so like between Jonathan and Ez, the
Mm.
stage design and typeface design things, I've been really, really having a lot of fun thinking about like the shows that we've been doing and like the things that I'm creating. And then also with Carrie Fisher, Wishful Drinking, like seeing how she uses media in her show in a similar way that like today we might see Hassan Minaj do with like
Mm.
things in his stand-up special where you can
Yeah, with
see
the
a screen
screens.
and media and those kinds of things. And that's something that I'm wanting to do in my stand-up, and like seeing the ways that people have used these different elements to say something, to create a feeling, to evoke an emotion, to tell a story. It's all really, really fascinating to me.
This is, I think, fascinating also from the creation standpoint because, as I mentioned, a lot of people who come on have been journalists. You worked for me at Variety. You had specific. I imagine your deadlines for your book were similar to the journalist deadlines because you're getting copy in and things like that. But when you're
Hmm.
creating a show and you're starting to think of, I'm not just writing what I'm going to say. I'm not just writing that stand-up set. I'm not just writing the questions in this game show. I'm also doing all of these things, the screens, the images that go on the screens, the stage design, the whatever, maybe even a little bit of the lighting. that all just adds up and adds up and adds up. And so
Hmm.
what I'm wondering now is how it affects your process in terms of how soon you have to start and how many things you can look at for inspiration, because you listed very specific ones right now, but I feel like there's a rabbit hole you can fall down, especially when you're like still
Absolutely.
kind of figuring out what you want your thing to be, but you can't fall down that rabbit hole because you probably have a deadline. What is
I
just, how
love
does this
this.
affect all of this?
Yeah, no. Well, so it's such an interesting question. I love being interviewed by journalists like that are like inquisitive and
We
curious.
ask weird things.
Our tour, we started like booking venues like September, August, I think last year, like looking at venues, right, to kind of figure out where we could go. And to me, it mattered that we were in Black venues that had that had some attachment to us, right? And so we did 4 cities. 3 of the cities were in historically Black places. We were at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library in DC. We were at the Schomburg in New York City. We were at the Gathering Spot in Atlanta. And then here in Los Angeles, we were at the Los Angeles LGBT Center. It was important to me that like people were coming to a space that said something already before we got there, right? And one of the things I've been really proud about with our book is that I've probably had a conversation with you about this or written about it, as like watching old shows.
Mhm.
I found that the more progressive older shows were, the better they age,
Yeah.
right? And like if you were like leaning for, and I always think about the Golden Girls and like how forward they were, how forward
Hmm.
thinking they were with talking about women's rights and abortion and queerness and AIDS and all kinds of different things, right? And it makes it still feel really relevant now. And so as we were approaching our book, I wanted to think about it that way. And I was like, this book is going to sit on someone's shelf more than it will be open, right? And
Mm.
like it will be picked up in the future and looked at, and like I want people to look at this book and feel like, oh wow, they were being progressive in this moment, talking, we are using different pronouns and we're talking
Yeah.
about queerness and we're talking about church and we're thinking about it in a progressive way. And so I think about that and the way that it impacts our reader. I think about what our show, what it's like to come into a space that is Black owned, that is run by Black people, that is run by people who love Black people and Blackness and are here to have this experience. And even if it's not Black people, right? Because we have people in our audience who are not
Yeah.
Black. And like wanting you to come into this space and be like, oh, we're doing something here, right? There's
Hmm.
music, there's a graphic, there's a sound, there's a thing here. And like in our show, we designed the show to be something that people would hopefully right respond to and be up on their feet and
Hmm.
singing the song that the person on stage is trying to get their extra points for, and like, and it happens, right? And like
Yeah.
you can engineer it a little bit, but it has to work, right? And now as I'm working on a stand-up special, I'm like, I'm literally in the process now of like locking in the date and we're
Mm.
putting in a deposit, and it's like, so we're really doing this now. You know what I
Well,
mean?
I
Like,
mean,
and
you're
like
really
I'm
doing it, but I wonder if, does it feel like you're really doing it when you're locking in the date, or does it feel like you're really doing it when you're standing on stage looking at where all the things are physically coming together?
it felt like we're really doing it 2 months ago when the idea that I had some conversations with people who I thought would be involved in it, and they
Mm.
were all like linked on it, and I was like,
Hmm.
oh, I'm not just like making this up. This is really going to happen. And
Nice.
like now we're putting in a deposit and like starting to work on marketing, right? And so like,
Nice.
but there's so many of those moments of like we're doing this, right? With Trevel on tour,
Hmm.
there was a moment a couple of weeks before tour where we're on Zoom and I was like, so we're going on tour. And they were like, yeah, girl, I sent you the flights. What do you mean? I was like, no, I mean, I know we're going on tour, but like, we're going on tour? Like, what are we doing? And then like, we're in DC and we're like, bitch, we're on tour right now. Like, what are we doing? You know what I mean? Like, we're 4 cities in.
Yeah.
And so, like, there's so many of those moments, like, we're actually doing this. But to your question about, like, how does it affect the process, I find there are some parts of it that are, like, consistent, like, figure out when, figure out
Mm, of
where,
course.
put in the venue. And then there are some parts of it that are just so organic. And, like, as I'm starting, I've had the idea for what I wanted to do for this special since, like, last fall, and like I have a series of specials that I want to do, and like they're
Mm.
all about something specific or about talking about something. And that is also the process though, right? Like I never stopped writing stand-up, even though I stopped doing it 12
Okay.
years ago. But this was an idea that like was a bit, and then it was like, oh, and then I could add that. Oh,
Mm.
oh my God. And then I could, and then it was like, let me copy this and put this in a real document outside of a note. You know what I mean? And then it was like, this is a thing.
Yeah.
And now it's 12 pages and a contract with the venue and a payment and a plan and a
Right.
design document and all this stuff. So I don't know if I answered your question there or
No, you
not, but
did. I mean, but I am also curious in terms of like the things that you're watching for the inspiration for whether it is the writing or whether it is the design. Do you cut yourself off at a certain point and say, like, I have to stop consuming other people's ideas because they're
oh,
affecting
absolutely. Yeah. Well, and like, to be honest with you, I'm also really trying to like not watch everything.
mine? Mhm.
Right? Like there's a list of different things I could be watching or checking out to go into stand up with and stuff like that. And there's a delicate balance because I think also the journalist in me is also like you should have an awareness of what's going on, right? In the culture. And like as a black person coming into comedy, it's a
Mhm.
very interesting time in black
Mhm.
comedy right now with the Cat Williams and the Monique and
Right.
the those kinds of things kind of like brewing and happening. And I'm like, it's important for me to know what people are out in the world saying. And I'm also like the person who's literally famous for calling out a plagiarist. So like I have to always be aware of it. Like I don't want to, if I'm making a reference, I need to make clear that this is a
Right. It's a
reference, right?
reference.
Yeah.
Fair. That's fair. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting though that you say that because one of the things that struck me so much when I was reading your book was so many of these terms I had heard used by white people growing up that had clearly appropriated it and probably didn't realize they had appropriated it. So then I started thinking about like, okay, well, yeah, if the first person you heard say it was not where it came from, that has to be so common. And I see that all the time in comedy where people are calling each other out on social media, like, this person just had a special and look, this is my same bit. And it's like, well, did that person steal from you? Or is the idea a common thought and you guys just developed it similarly? I don't know how that happens because artists are different, but that to me is such a scary part of all of this of just like everybody's got the receipts right now, but are the receipts right or are they being interpreted by your own lens, your own perspective?
Well, and like this is such a problem like in this industry in so many different ways. But if we're thinking about it from a comedy standpoint, even like linking it back to daytime, right? Like, oh,
Mm.
we did that segment already, right?
Mm.
Like there are shows that we have pitched doing the book, doing something from the book on their show. And then there have been multiple segments where they've been talking about black language and black
Mm.
speak. And I'm like, no, I know you know what I'm like,
Yeah,
but
you
at the
stole
same
my
time,
idea.
right. But it's also like, how many of us are having conversations about these things on TikTok or on Twitter or
Mm.
Instagram? Like, and so it's an interesting dynamic to like kind of figure out how you say something that feels unique and specific and special and know that like you're not the only person that's ever felt it or thought it or like maybe even put together an idea in that way. We also have like so many people putting out content now in a
Right.
way that we didn't in the 90s or early 2000s, right? There's so many more comics with videos on
Mm-hmm.
platforms that we can see. And so it's hard to figure out like how do you say something. And I was working on my opening of like how I think I'm going to start the show, which at this point probably means it won't be how I start the show. But like I was thinking about the open and I'm like, oh, I've never heard someone say that before.
Mm.
Huh. Okay. Well, in that case, maybe that does work as a great moment to open with, right?
Right.
And, God forbid I see someone in May say this on TikTok or something. You know what I mean? Like, and then what?
I mean, that's
So
what's so hard about all of it is because, it's also the timing. Like for the people at home, I literally started this podcast with Jarrett being like, "Hey, try not to reference time because it's going to come out a few weeks after we tape it and we don't want to date ourselves too much." But I mean, I don't know. I think sometimes it is some people process things really fast and they have a quick hit that they'll throw up on TikTok. But then if you are writing like a quote unquote real show, like a longer form, you need to fill an hour. I'm not calling TikTok not real. I'm just saying it's a different level because it's short form content. Um, you know, that special needs time to be developed and then done, and then sometimes recorded, edited, and pushed out. And then, yeah, of course, you're going to have people that are saying similar things because we've all had the time to think about them, but maybe you developed it earlier and we just didn't know that.
Well, and like so many of us are had we're talking about daytime talk shows, and like so many of us were watching that same episode at the same time.
Yeah,
Right?
it's
So
different
many
now.
of us were informed by the same pieces of IP, or, watching the
Oh,
same shows, or were, listening to the same song,
right.
or had a similar friend who saw the thing and came to us and said, "Did you see?" Right? I was writing a bit that like I was thinking about the look on my face, and there's this moment on Oprah where Oprah and Gail had gone back in time to the pioneer days for a PBS show, which
I don't think I saw that.
there's a lot of challenges with the premise now
Yeah,
in
but I just feel
2024
like
for
if I
me,
had
but
seen that,
yeah.
I'd remember it.
Well, like it's a great episode. I'll send you the link. It's really
Okay.
funny. But like they go back in time, and there's this little moment where Oprah's cooking bacon over like an open fire and a cast iron skillet, and Gail comes over and she's like, "Oh, I'd like mine extra crispy." And Oprah looks at her like she could throw the bacon at her and the grease, right? Like there's just this look on her face. And I was like, oh, I might use that clip in my
Mm,
special, right? And I'm like, how many people also saw this moment and thought this
mm.
moment is hysterical? Right? Has anyone else used it in this kind of way before? I don't know. Like, do I need to go down a rabbit hole? Like, all that kind of stuff is like something I'm
Yeah.
thinking about as I'm working on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I don't think you should have to go down the rabbit hole. I think if it fits what you're doing, even if somebody else has used it, it doesn't matter because you're not claiming that's your clip. You're
Right.
acknowledging this is somebody else's clip. I think it fits this moment. And it's culturally a thing that other people who have seen it, it's a shorthand for us to understand this moment because of the reaction. It's a
Mhm.
meme ultimately, right? Like, and
That's
that's what
real.
we're doing with memes. We're just taking
That's so
one
true.
person's IP and stamping our own stuff on it, and that's allowed. So I don't know. Maybe I just shot myself in the foot by saying that's,
No, I'm gonna
but
send this logic to my lawyer, just to be clear, because I
yeah, and
like
tell
it.
them I sent you. No, don't. I have no legal training at all. And as everybody who has listened to this podcast knows, even my little legal disclaimers in the podcast are not probably in the right language. Like I do tell people, and I will actually do this right now. I tell everyone where to watch the things that we've talked about in the episode because I feel like if you haven't seen it, it's something that hopefully they want to see
That's
now
great.
after we've talked about it, right? But like here's the disclaimer. You can send this to your lawyer too. If this episode inspired you to watch any of the shows we discussed, here's where you can find them as of the taping of this episode. Please note, Made Possible by Pop Culture is not sponsored by or getting any perks from these services for sharing this information. Who
Mm.
knows, right? So for us, I will say
Come on,
that
journalist.
unfortunately, most of the talk shows we've talked about are not streaming in full anywhere, except the Oprah show is on Discovery Plus. But I feel like The View, Wendy Williams show, the Rosie O'Donnell show, they're on, you can find clips on YouTube for sure. I don't know if I should be directing people to YouTube because they're probably pirated, but here we go.
Well, what's interesting is, so the Oprah show, they have a lot of full episodes on YouTube from OWN.
Okay.
And so like the one that I was watching when they go back in time, that was a full episode that was on the own YouTube. I've also seen like there are YouTubers that are like putting out full episodes of Wendy Williams from back in the day, and I'm like,
Right, but
how is
like
this
that's
happening?
not
What's going
allowed.
on?
So that's what I mean. I feel bad being like, go watch that when she's not getting paid for
Yeah,
that.
yeah. I don't know how that's working, but it
Yeah.
certainly doesn't seem like it's legal. But there's a lot of different things, a lot of different ways to see a lot of the old talk shows.
Yeah.
And then
Well, I was gonna say
the
the Carrie Fisher Wishful Drinking is streaming on Max, and then
yes.
obviously Abstract the Art of Design is on Netflix, which we talked about. So I'm excited. I'm so excited to see your stand up and what you do next. So thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely.
And I will, if by the time this episode is out, if you have your stand-up dates and cities, we'll put that in the comments, but we'll certainly put it on social. So, if you're listening to this Made Possible by Pop Culture episode, please like, comment, subscribe, follow on social media. You'll get a lot of extras on social between the taping of this and the streaming. I don't even want to say airing because that makes me sound 100.
I do the same thing. I'm like, we're taping this and it's gonna air when? They're like, we're recording it and it's going to post.
Oh, that's true. I said taping 7,000 times and we're not
I do
using
it all the
tape.
time.
I mean, the good news about as much as I get on a high horse about like language changing, at least everyone knows what I mean when I say that. Because
Yes.
colloquial, it's yeah. Oof. And also, where do you want to? I know your book is available in a lot of places. Where do you want to direct them to get it? Is there like a specific place you feel like is the best place for them to pick it up?
So the book is available everywhere you buy books. We always direct people to historicallyblackphrases.com because there's a link to be able to get the signed copies, or you can find it at your more local retailers. And the signed copies come from Reparations Club here in Los Angeles. They're a Black woman-owned bookstore that we love, and we sign copies for them periodically. So historicallyblackphrases.com. And when we're on tour, again, we'll be doing more shows later this summer, it looks like. And so historicallyblackphrases.com/live. For information on the game show, and my website is Jarrett Hill, so you can find the things I'm doing there, and I'll be posting about the special soon because I've got a date and we've got like things coming now, so we're really excited about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.